Ideology has a few different definitions that various scholars have given to it, but the most important thing to remember is that your thoughts are not completely your own. They're conditioned by other things going on around you in the world. So we need to do this exercise of mentalizing other people, imagining what they think and why they think the ways that they do. What you think tends to be convenient for you for certain reasons, and we will get into those reasons now, along with the scholars who devised them. So the first theory of ideology that you will find important from our readings is the idea that ideology is false consciousness. And this is a kind of a split of thinking between the false consciousness of the surface reality of the world and the real or accurate consciousness of our objective structural situation. And the thinker that's most associated with this, does anybody remember from our readings? This is going to be Karl Marx. This is Karl Marx's version of how ideology works. So consequently, this is a type of language that you will encounter if you are at socialist clubs. If you hang around with radically political groups, you will hear a lot about false consciousness and the false consciousness associated with capitalism. So the false consciousness is what convinces you to go along with the way that the world is today, but a real understanding of your situation might persuade you, according to Karl Marx, towards some sort of revolution. To think about the difference between false consciousness and material reality, let's consider the case of someone who is extremely wealthy, maybe even somebody who has generational wealth. So if you imagine that you inherited not just a house, but a castle from your parents. You inherited a huge aristocratic, nobility-inducing amount of land. And consider how you might think about this land that you inherited. Do you want to just think to yourself, I was just lucky, I was just given everything I have, I didn't need to work at all. In fact, I probably will never need to work to own my special castle and to have privileges that other people don't have? Or might you come up with a different way of thinking for yourself? Imagine all of the rich people that you see on Instagram and on other social media platforms, and how often they say something like, I earned everything that I have. Even somebody like Donald Trump says that he earns what he has, even though he started with a lot more money than you or I have. Rich people often say that they earned all the things that they have, even though inheriting money is a big part of how most people become rich. And this way of thinking is convenient because it keeps up people's morale. If you are lucky, you come into a whole bunch of money in the world, thinking to yourself about all of the struggles that you had in life that led to you coming up with that money is good for your mental state. It can make you happy, it can make you confident, even though it's not completely true. Conversely, if you don't have any money, and even if you are extremely impoverished, you might think to yourself, well, this makes sense. It's just the way that the world is, because I'm not the smartest person in the world. Maybe my IQ is lower than the really rich people. Maybe I'm not going to make the great innovations that make the future of the world the way it is. So maybe they deserve their huge amounts of wealth, and I don't deserve that amount of wealth. I deserve just what I have in the world today, and the world is fair. And at least it's secure in some sense, even if you are not the winner of the great capitalist game. However, the structure of the world doesn't support these simplistic beliefs. In fact, it is possible to be wealthy just because you were lucky and not because you were smart. And it is possible to be a great contributor to society and still not get paid nearly enough. If you consider the amount of money that someone who operates as an influencer makes from promoting certain products that are not necessary in the world versus the amount of money that your average construction worker or healthcare assistant makes doing jobs that everybody knows are essential. And if you also consider the difficulty of those jobs, you know that the way that the world is not completely fair. The structures of the world are not completely secure or righteous, and so the senses of righteousness that we have about the world tend to involve some amount of false consciousness. However, other ways exist to think about how ideology works. So if we transpose ourselves from the world of 1800s Germany to France, to a group of thinkers in post-war France who were reviving the work of Karl Marx, re-exploring his ideas and trying to make them make sense for the more modern world, we arrive at the idea that comes most specifically from the French thinker Louis Althusser, which is that ideology is habitual behavior. So it's not necessarily an illusion that we have about the world. Ideology is not necessarily an illusion or something that tricks us or even a way that we trick ourselves. Instead, it's just habits that we have. So we just keep going along with the world the way it is, even though we could potentially do other things that would be more objectively suited to our interests. And the classic example of Louis Althusser's notion of ideology involves a police officer. So if you think about the situation where you are walking down the street and you walk past a police officer, and after you walk past, you hear somebody yell, "Hey, you there, you." And maybe it's the voice of the police officer. What do you instinctively do? What do we instinctively do? How many of you instinctively turn? How many of us would instinctively turn to go, who is calling us? And then coincidentally, how many of you would not turn around? How many of you just keep going or go, I hope that person's not talking to me, I'm just going to keep going where I'm going? Okay, so the people who do not turn for the police saying, hey, you there, are also not putting up their hands. We have half the class saying, yes, I would turn around, and half the class not putting up their hands at all, which means either some people are not sure or some people are unwilling to say, which I think makes sense. So for Althusser, the hey, you there that the police officer says is what he called the hail. He called it the policeman's hail. So to hail somebody is when you say hello, but in post-war France that had been occupied by the Nazis, there's also an implication here that the police officer might be the representative of a totalitarian regime. There's also a connotation of occupying police, maybe even Nazi police, and maybe even a connection with a certain Nazi slogan. Althusser was not a fan of police. So when a police officer says, or someone else with authority says, hey, you there, many people's instinct is to turn and look at the person and figure out what is going on. And this is an important habit that we have. It gives us information, but it also reinforces the power of whatever regime that we are in. Althusser uses the term interpellate for this action that the police officer does, interpellate. It comes from Latin to do with calling somebody else. So when you interpolate somebody else's actions, you call for them in a way that gets their attention and causes them to acknowledge you. The most important part of this idea, though, is to remember that every time that something interrupts your actions and calls your attention to it, it's calling you into a power relationship that reinforces not just your structure of attention, but also the power structure of whatever you are attending to. In this way, even a domineering police force or an oppressive force almost negotiates a kind of back and forth relationship with the people who are being subjugated. It's not exactly the same as consent, but if you're in a position where you are working, say, for a boss that you don't like, who is a bully, you will still tend to look to that boss when they demand your attention. You still have a habit of working for the boss, reinforcing their authority in a way. And that's what Althusser notices about ideology. So we can believe one thing, but still reinforce a regime through our habits. Now, you'll find in our readings a third thinker cited about ideology, and this is the theorist Slavoj Žižek. And Žižek is known for his humor. He's quite a funny guy. Maybe at the end of class today, I'll have some time to show you some of his videos. And Žižek is full of irony. He is a font of irony. So for him, ideology is what we pretend to believe together. It's not even necessarily our habits. It's not necessarily what we do. It's not necessarily what we actually believe. It's what we tell each other we believe to get along in society. And for Žižek, society always has unwritten rules that clash with the written or expressed rules. And the purpose of those unwritten rules is to filter people from situation to situation. They define insiders and outsiders for each situation. You can almost think of this as a way of creating privacy in public, as we group ourselves into insiders and outsiders, people who get the inside joke, the ironic sense of things, versus people who are stuck at the surface level of each interaction, who only grasp the written rules. A consequence of Žižek's theory, though, if you are agreeing with what he says, is that we can get ourselves into situations where all of us even think something is true, but none of us can say it. So you don't have to tell me this. You can keep this a secret for yourself. But think to yourself right now, what might be some things that I believe that I don't think I'm allowed to say? Do I have any political opinions, for example, that would get me in trouble if I spoke them? Or do I have any aesthetic opinions that would get me in trouble if I spoke them? Are there any artists, for example? Are there any singers or actors that everybody around me loves? Everybody says they are the best, but secretly I don't think they're the best. I think their music is boring, or I think something else negative about these people that everybody seems to love. And then ask yourself, what if everybody else was in the same situation as you? What if there are opinions or aesthetic judgments that we all have? Maybe there are even foods that we all sort of pretend to like that actually are not as popular as it would appear on the surface level of society. Žižek is a controversial thinker. He's constantly taking up controversial positions. And I think the best way to deal with Žižek's approach to thinking in general is to consider him as somebody who generates ideas and gives you ideas to think with, but not to force you to think those ideas. So the idea that we could share opinions that we don't express is very hard to prove, obviously. And even I can tell you, when I receive course evaluations even, oftentimes people fill in a certain part of the course evaluation that says they learned a bunch of math in this class. Sometimes I get 4 out of 5 people, so 80% of people say they learned some math in this class. And while I like to try and include many forms of reasoning in each of my classes, oftentimes Communications 130 ends up not including any math, realistically. So I think what's going on is that people are wanting to maybe support me, or they're trying to spread good favor in the world. In general, they're just, they feel that the right thing to do is to say on that question that maybe this class contributed to math somehow, even though maybe probably it didn't. And that's just the done thing. That's just the thing that we sort of do together using the course evaluations. So when I receive that evaluation, I always think that's a little bit funny, because I think, why did people think that they had to, why do people feel a need to say that? Anyway, it's also entirely possible that the things that you're writing to yourselves in your notes actually do improve your math skills. Maybe you get some math out of this experience that I don't include in the lectures. With that said, the world of discourse, the things that we say to each other, are not always the same as the things that we think or experience. So those are our three notions of ideology, So the first one is false consciousness, ideology as false consciousness. Yep, ideology as habit, and ideology as beliefs, pretend to believe.
But those are still beliefs. Even though you pretend to, you still have your own beliefs. But you're just not.
Yes, we could say that they're pretenses, they're pretense, pretending.